Whoa. Moar's doing well for herself, Sheeta commented, as she looked up the large, smooth building that Nia had led her and the group towards. Apparently, everybody else had decided to stop hanging out in the open, and Moar had offered that they could all relax at her place for a bit before it was time to head to Earth. Nia sniggered as she moved towards the front door, probably to request entry. However, at least both Tuyu and Coco seemed to be somewhat on the same page with Sheeta, as their eyes also wandered up the mirroring walls of glass that formed the blocky house, which looked almost out of place in its proportions next to some other buildings that were clearly constructed with human occupancy in mind, as it was scaled up at least 2 times from the normal-sized ones. For Sheeta herself, the size itself was of course not all that surprising, as she had spent most of her life around this exact dimension of structures, but it appeared that the flats inside were still bigger than the cabins on the GES had been, which still meant that the old lady was moving up in the world. Nia now waved them over as the large door popped open in front of her, and together the 4 women looked up the many differently sized staircases that waited for them on the inside. With a single glance at the largest of the set, it became obvious that the reference of an off-worlder the designer of this building once had in mind was the humans' neighbours, the Tanastrosites and Parishni. The larger steps were long and not particularly high, making them perfect to ascend for the hexapedal Sauropsida, but very mildly inconvenient for upright walking species. But they were still functional enough, most likely. And of course, Sheeta was happy just using the human-sized stairs, which the primates obviously knew how to build well, so it didn't bother her either way. These were just the random things she noticed after years of living with and thinking about communal designs. However, today, packed with their shopping trip's bounties hanging off both her arms and shopping bags, Sheeta didn't exactly feel like scaling this mountain of a building on foot, and therefore the group called down an elevator for themselves, and quickly rode it upwards to their floor. The first thing that greeted them up there was an unusually thick carpet that made walking along the large, box-like hall lined with doors a slight challenge, as Sheeta's feet sank into it with each slightly bouncy step she took. If Sheeta had to guess why that was, she assumed that humans, new to this kind of design, really had simply taken their own plans for houses like this one, and just scaled them up. Then again, who knew if there was supposed to be a different use for this? Either way, a few doors down, they had apparently reached their destination, as Nia pressed a doorbell that was right next to the large frame. It didn't take long before they were granted entrance into Moar's humble abode. Dark green lined the sharp, flat walls, as Sheeta stepped inside and looked at the sparingly furnished space. She also noticed the display of camera feeds right next to the side of the door.
"Welcome, everyone,"
Moar greeted happily, and stepped aside so her massive form wouldn't block any of the Deathworlders from entering.
"Make yourself at home. Oh, and feel free to keep your shoes on."
Sheeta's first order of business was to place the bags of her purchases down right next to the door, while everyone else busied themselves greeting the large old lady, after forgoing to do so thoroughly earlier. Then she looked around the room, which was surprisingly empty. Curi had placed themselves on one of the 2 massive armchairs standing on each side of a comparatively moderately sized table, leaving Sheeta to assume that Moar had most likely been sitting in the other one before the group had arrived. However, apart from that, nobody seemed to be around. Seeing as Moar was still busy for the moment, Sheeta approached the cyborg, and once again glanced around in case she was missing something. "Hey," she greeted, and, so she wouldn't constantly have to stare up, she quickly climbed up the upholstery. That easily had room for 2 more people their size, before it would feel crowded on there. "Am I missing something, or has everyone else run off on us?" Curi looked at Sheeta for a second, their black body mildly shining in the dim light as it shifted around. "No," they replied, forgoing any renewed greeting and getting to answering straight away. "After a few minutes of being here, Mr. Krieger announced that he would like to prepare something back on Earth before everyone arrived, and therefore took an early leave. The Admiral and the Commander in turn decided that they would accompany him and go on ahead, as they say, saying everyone else could follow after them once they completed their business on Mars." Sheeta nodded along. That sounded about right. There was probably no reason for those guys to stick around. After all, they weren't quite invested in this reunion. And Flynn likely had plans for James later, during which he would see his nephew more than enough. However, speaking of James, and the other 2? Sheeta asked, and glanced over to the 3 doors, seemingly leading away from the main living area of the flat. Curi also turned in their direction, and lifted one of their backwards legs to point at one of them that wasn't quite closed all the way, and instead just seemed to lean against the frame. "Conglorsh and James are in the kitchen," they explained. "They went to talk among themselves and they fell asleep." Sheila once again nodded along, however she abruptly stopped when she heard that. "Fell asleep?" she asked in slight disbelief. Curi shifted into a nod. "Yes," they simply answered, apparently not figuring that Sheila was trying to get an explanation for that out of them. Therefore, the feline turned back towards the leaning door and looked at it suspiciously. Excusing herself with a brief gesture of her hands, she scooted off the armchair again, hitting the carpeted floor with a soft thump after falling for a second, and then slowly snuck towards the large wooden barrier, separating her from the kitchen. Once she reached it, she pressed her head up to the door, trying to peek through the slight gap in between door and frame, while also turning her ears in the direction of the separate room. She could hear soft breathing coming from the inside. Well, soft was relative when talking about an almost 4 measures tall lizard, of course, but considering the circumstances, it did sound peaceful enough. And every now and then, when the two didn't perfectly align in some way, there was a second, much softer breath mixing into it as well. Not seeing anything yet, but feeling emboldened by what she pretty confidently identified as the sounds of sleeping, she began to push the large door open. She was lucky that it was already cracked, otherwise trying to somehow utilize the handle might have been a problem for the undersized feline. But like this, she was more than strong enough to just push the swinging thing out of the way. Gradually she crept into the room, carefully sticking her head around the corner as soon as she had enough room for it, careful not to make any unnecessary sound. Inside, she saw floor and walls covered in black and white tiles, along with a large kitchen counter with a grey top. However, neither those nor the different oversized appliances really registered to her, because in the middle of the comparatively small room, her eyes landed on the prize. Along the far wall of the room, there was a dark indigo mass laying curled up on the floor. The Tyrannosaur's enormous jaws were placed right on top of his arms that lay crossed on the ground, and his long whip-like tail was curling around him like a circle. Each in and exhale sounded like a breeze rushing through thick leaves, as the thick protective plates covering most of his enormous body shifted slightly with each deep breath the Titan took, and his back slowly rose and sank in intervals of about 10 to 20 seconds. And in the middle of the crooked circle that the body of the enormous yet peacefully slumbering predator formed was a smaller form, half sitting and half lying leaned against the Tyrannosaur's side, slightly shifting from deep breaths of his own, but also gently rocked by the shifting plates of the Titan. James's face was peacefully leaned to the side, with some of his black hair falling over his closed eyes as he snoozed away. His organic arm lay flatly on his stomach, while the mechanical prosthetic on his right looked like it had dropped dead to the floor at some point, and was now limply slumping away from him in an odd angle that surely would have hurt had it not been for the arm's flexibility. On the ground next to it was James's phone, looking like it had likely been dropped there instead of being carefully placed down, based on the odd positioning. She'd have concluded that James had been using the device to show something off, before suddenly dozing off. She'd began to grin at the sight and shook her head as she fully pushed the door open and stepped inside the room with her arms crossed. There they were, 2 mighty predators, ruthless warriors, the scourges of the GCS, both dropped by a long day on the kitchen floor of an old lady. Absolute dorks. Instinctually, she'd have realized how odd of a sight this probably should have been, seeing her boyfriend peacefully sleeping right next to her head, with jaws big enough to nearly swallow him in one bite, and lined with large dagger-like teeth. But days like that were long in the past in these modern times, and she knew that there was no reason to even be concerned about something like that. These days it was just a funny thought. A brief flash of light lighting up almost right next to her head suddenly made Sheila blink for a moment, and she quickly turned her head to see where it came from. Next to her, Nia stood with her phone raised and pointed at the sleeping pair, an eternalized picture of the slumber now displayed on the device's screen for inspection. And she wasn't alone. Behind her, Coco and Tuya also both inspected the photograph with mixed expressions. "Oh, that is just precious," Coco cooed, with what sounded like honest adoration, as her eyes jumped around between the picture and the 2 sleeping men before her, and her expression was one of absolute delight. Meanwhile, Tuya had a contemplative gaze on her face as she studied the photo. "Honestly, that looks a bit too metal to try and tease him with," she commented. "Sleeping on a giant lizard just can't really look embarrassing." Nia took a half step backwards so her shoulder would bump against Tuya's chest, and let her head drop to the side, bringing her temple to the lieutenant's as well. "I wasn't going to tease him with it," she said, with a drawn-out drawl, and giggled. "I'm just glad that not all things have changed." Tuya shrugged, noticeably using only the shoulder that Nia wasn't currently leaning against. "I don't know. Change can be good," she said, and now also allowed her head to lean against that of Nia. To which, almost instantly, another flash of light erupted, this time coming from Coco's phone, after the commander had apparently smelled something worth snapping coming from a mile away. "Precious," she repeated herself with a snigger, and inspected the picture she had taken. She had expected the other women to protest, however they seemed to just smile it off and quickly went back to paying attention to each other, instead of the commander or James. "Do you think I should wake him?" Sheeta asked, turning towards Coco as it seemed that Nia was busy. The commander shook her head with a gentle smile on her face. "Let him sleep," she said, in a, for her, unusually calm tone of voice. "He's probably going to need this." Sheeta nodded, and Coco quickly put an arm onto her shoulder while accompanying her out of the kitchen and back into the living room, where Moar had once again lowered her massive form into the second large armchair that didn't look quite so large anymore now that she was sitting in it. Seeing as it was probably as good a time as any to get this out of the way, Sheeta moved to climb up the upholstery once more, trying to get on a more even level with the old lady, who quickly took one of her long arms aside, so Sheeta could sit down on the armrest after she had climbed up. Crossing her legs, Sheeta looked up at Moar's face, that was still a good bit higher up than her, even from this position. The old lady's large horns blocked out the light from the lamps above in two thick shadows, as she looked down at Sheeta with a gentle expression.
"James told me what happened to your face,"
the senior Raphaelite then mildly said, her gaze once again seeming to wander along the red streaks that ran across Sheeta's cheek.
"Are you all right?"
Sheeta exhaled slowly and ultimately nodded. "It doesn't bother me," she said earnestly, and put her hand onto her scars for a second before letting it sink down again and looking back up at Moar. "What else has he told you already?" However, Moar slowly shook her head with a smile on her face.
"I want to hear it from you as well,"
she informed Sheeta with the slightest hint of a tease in her gentle voice.
"So, I'm not telling you."
Sheeta rolled her eyes and shifted her legs a bit to make herself more comfortable, and also so she wasn't solely facing Moar anymore, but instead could also glance over at Curi, who still occupied the other armchair. At least as far as Sheeta could tell, the cyborg had already been listening attentively, but now that she had turned towards them, their stiff gaze shifted more in her direction, in a movement that Sheeta interpreted as an appreciative one, even if she couldn't be sure that that was the intention. Exhaling slowly, the feline rubbed her cheek. "Well, where do I start?" The next hour or more was spent with Sheeta recapping the events that unfolded on her homeworld for those who hadn't been able to come along themselves. Of course, she had to leave out the more classified details that had unfolded towards the end of their journey, as well as any specific mention of one of their new, less-than-usual allies made along the way. But luckily it seemed that at least Moar was way more interested in some of the tertiary details anyway. The food crisis in the cities concerned her. She was both mortified and quite amused by Sheeta's mention of the group's stay in a brothel overnight, even though Sheeta left out what exactly had happened during that night for obvious reasons. She seemed especially noticeably worried about Sheeta's retelling about the event that earned her the new scars, especially at the mention of James's behaviour during it. Her face turned glum and contemplative, with a concerned wet sheen taking hold of her dark eyes, while she scratched her claws along the notches of her horns. Sheeta couldn't blame her. It was very different from the size of James that the old lady herself had gotten to know, after all. However, the mood did lighten slightly again as Sheeta came to the end of her story, dancing around the specific reasons and people involved so she wouldn't reveal too much. Sheeta described their last day on the Deathworld and their second visit to the apparently not-so-frigid south.
That almost sounds like James found himself a tiny admirer. I hope you don't mind a little competition.
The Raphaelite joked, in that old woman way that was basically the only way to make the suggestion of a child trying to have an affair with an adult man not sound like the utterly grotesque and creepy thought that it was in reality. Sheida still shot her down, though. She's too young for that, she said, folding her hands while massaging their backs with her thumbs. She just liked the attention. Can't really fault her with that many siblings. Moar, seemingly up for a bit of a light-hearted challenge, tilted her head.
The attention she got during one meeting?
She asked with a hint of contradiction in her voice.
Are you sure that checks out?
Sheida shrugged her shoulders. You'd be surprised how quickly kittens get attached to people, she said, with a slight hesitance creeping into her voice that she hadn't intended to be there. Especially if they don't have much of a caregiver. I mean, I'm sure Zishadi does his best in a way, but... Maybe it was better to end the sentence there, before she would insult anyone. However, while the Komatopano leader did seem to genuinely care for the children in a way, he also didn't seem like the caregiving type. Having grown up as a Dunamur orphan, Sheida knew the type. Moar nodded slowly and lifted her arm, putting her hand on Sheida's back.
And did you mean it?
She asked. Sheida tilted her head with an ear lifted, her hesitant demeanour melting away. Mean what? She wondered.
That you take her along some day,
Moar cleared up, and Sheida's eyes widened slightly at the question, before she averted her gaze from the old lady. If she was being honest, she hadn't really thought much about that. It had just been something she said back then. Not a lie specifically. She had never intended on not following up on her words specifically. She just had never thought about actually doing so. Who knows? Was the only thing she could finally reply. Really, who knew? Everything was uncertain right now. With everything that was happening, she couldn't even tell if she would still be a free woman around the time when taking in a protégé would be a feasible thing to do for her. Or in a worse case, if she would be alive, for that matter. These were uncharted waters they were traversing here, and the galaxy wouldn't look kindly upon them if they didn't play their cards exactly right. Though I think I'd like to, if I ever get the chance. That last thought slipped out of her, attaching itself to her answer without permission of her brain. Moar smiled a warm smile, that made Sheida immediately look away again as she briefly glanced up at the large face. The pride in the old woman's expression was misplaced. It probably wouldn't even come to that. As she turned away, her eyes got stuck to Curi, who was still staring at her with their unmoving expression. The cyborg had been so quiet during the conversation that she had kind of faded their presence out of her mind. However, now that she had made eye contact with them, Curi apparently felt addressed to speak. You're lying, the cyborg stated matter-of-factly, although a hint of an accusation also entered their tone. No, you're hiding something. Moar stopped her proud smile and looked over at the cyborg in confusion, while Sheida tried to hold the gaze of their red, synthetic eyes. However, as always, Curi's visage was unblinking and unflinching, and trying to win a stare down with them was basically a matter of impossibility. She thought about denying it, about trying to play it off, or about coming up with some nonsense about what she was hiding. Maybe even a hint about their night in the brothel. That might get the cyborg to back off. However, even that way of thinking, that would have usually been quite natural to her, just didn't feel right here anymore. Especially due to Curi's tone. She knew that the cyborg despised lying. In fact, that might have still been putting it lightly. But still, they seemed to be relatively calm about this, even though they had seen right through her. A show of great restraint for them, if she was being honest. Slowly, she lowered her hands onto her knees. She also couldn't help but notice the gazes of Coco and Tuya shoot over towards her, so obviously that Nia glanced around in between them confusedly for a moment. Apparently, they had paid attention as well. But they didn't have to worry. She wasn't green enough to give away important info, even if, for the first time in her life, it felt like her mind was trying to prevent her from keeping a secret. This sucked. Her ears hanging down, and her tail softly gliding along the cushion of the armrest, she quickly exhaled. I can't talk about some stuff, she explained, looking back into the cyborg's red eyes. It was an official mission and some of it is classified. Talking about it would get me all kinds of sacked. Even mentioning it like this is highly discouraged. In the distance, she saw Coco nod, before turning her attention down towards her phone, while Tuya's gaze almost immediately returned to Nia, picking the conversation back up like nothing happened.
I see, Moar mumbled. Well, that's understandable.
However, the giant was never who Sheeta had been worried about here. She looked at Curi, and Curi looked at her silently for a good few seconds. I couldn't be trusted with classified information, the cyborg began to say, but Sheeta immediately raised her arms defensively. That's not what I'm saying at all. She started to try and correct the situation. Even though the cyborg technically wasn't wrong there, that was certainly not what she had tried to say here. However, now it was Curi's turn to interrupt her almost immediately. I know, they said, gesturing with one of their backwards legs calmingly. It's what I'm saying. Information that could hurt people if revealed should be kept far away from me. For a moment, it seemed like they had just reconsidered their stance in the meantime. However, a slightly saddened tone that kept into their voice made Sheeta listen up. What happened, Curi? She asked, concerned. And now, despite their unflinching visage, the cyborg immediately turned their gaze away. I made a mistake, and caused trouble, they said, every word seeming like it took a mountain of willpower to force it out of their voice box. However, despite that, they kept on going. I cannot tell you about it. I'm sorry. Please don't think I'm lying. She'd moved to dig further into this absolutely vague answer. However, a claw on her shoulder stopped her, and made her look back up at Moar.
If they could at all tell you about it, they would,
the old Raphaelite assured her, which wasn't honestly necessary. Curi's entire demeanour guaranteed as much, and that wasn't even mentioning the fact that Sheeta knew Curi.
But they're not in any danger, and the trouble is being resolved as we speak, from what I hear. Therefore, we'll surely learn about it in due time.
Sheeta swallowed heavily, but nodded. I'm so sorry, Curi, she instead said emphatically. I almost wished that she could hug the cyborg, but they were too far away for that. I'm sure everything will turn out all right. Thanks, Curi replied, though their mood didn't seem to lift much, which made Sheeta think. So, she mumbled, and deep inside she almost felt her past self dreading what she was going to do now, even though she now knew it to be the right thing to do. If you can't talk about that, what else have you been working on in the meantime? Curi slightly perked up, but it seemed that the question alone wasn't quite enough to get them excited. I returned to my drone refinery attachment project with the help of the humans, they said, sounding more like they were going through the motions in their answer, which led Sheeta to try and inject a little more life into the conversation. The thing with the supercapacitors and the heat coils? She asked, while sitting up slightly, her ears standing attentively, and her tail slightly swaying through the air. The cyborg paused briefly. I'm surprised you remember any of it, they said, brutally honest, and studied the feline for a second, their body lifting up ever so slightly higher. Sheeta lifted a flat hand in an implied shrug. I mean, it did blow up in our face, she explained with slight amusement, and a slight smile on her face. It's kind of hard to forget that, especially after spending a stressful hour sifting through the debris with you. Curi's forward arms crossed, as they turned their entire body to fully face Sheeta again. It was sabotaged, they informed her firmly, apparently defensive about their invention's security even now. Sheeta's smile got a bit wider. And did it work correctly this time, now that you could properly test it? She asked candidly, and tilted her head to the side. Curi shifted their bodies slightly, and began to sway in place a bit. Well, for all intents and purposes it did work, but upon testing, the energy consumption was a lot higher than my calculations predicted, meaning there was likely an error somewhere in the system and led to an unwanted circuit being formed between unintended parts, the cyborg began. And like that, Sheeta knew she had them. And at first, I could not figure out which parts would possibly be connected in a way that would allow for that to form. However, thinking back to the sabotage on the previous model, I remembered that the saboteurs somehow managed to divert a substantial amount of power towards the hulls of the supercapacitors, or the bomb they had been replaced with in this case, which led me to investigate that area specifically, which in turn led me to discover that, between some of the wiring, the resistance of the alloy used to attach them was plummeting at extreme temperatures, which meant that electric current could leak through those parts once the machine reached its working temperature. You see, in all my previous testing with it, the material worked well as an isolator. However, admittedly, she didn't exactly understand all too much about the following explanations about the exact physics involved in the problem. However, she did figure that the solution of ultimately replacing the problematic material was probably a sensible one. Then again, it was very clear in the cyborg's explanations, complicated as they may have been, that it was far less about having discovered the solution to their problem for them. Instead, the whole mechanism due to which problem arose in the first place seemed to fascinate them a whole lot more than the rather simple solution, for which they wouldn't even need to have known what exactly happened. At least, they were explaining it with their usual gusto. And for once, although her brain buzzed at the many technical disruptions or physical constants she had no idea about, she didn't really mind listening, even if all she got out of it was Curi's excited tone. It wasn't exactly my preferred solution, as I would usually create a new, specialized part to take the place of the previous one, likely with a tweaked material that would keep its isolating properties at higher temperatures. However, the pre-made parts provided by the humans did save a lot of time and allowed us to develop a provisional test, which, despite the imperfect part, came a lot closer to the predicted efficiency, which meant that a first model could be created using the already commercially available parts, while the specialized one was in revision. So, the cyborg still rambled on many minutes later, when suddenly movement caught everyone's attention. With slightly stiffened movement and rubbing some sleep out of his eyes, James emerged from the kitchen, pushing the enormous door open without much effort in the process. He looked around the room for a second, taking in everyone's faces, before a yawn started to escape him. "Hey everyone," he greeted, waving with his mechanical hand while his organic one covered his mouth, and his voice was still distorted by the yawn. "When did you all get back?" Nia was the first to reply, glancing down at a clock on her wrist briefly, before she said, "A bit more than 2 hours ago." James froze for a moment before perking up and pulling his phone from his pocket, after he had apparently picked it up from the floor earlier. 2 hours? He asked in a mixture of surprise and shock, as he seemingly checked the time for himself. "Why didn't you wake me?" "You look so peaceful." Coco nearly cheered at him, and moved over with open arms, seemingly trying to hug him from the side, which James however averted by planting a flat hand against her sternum and keeping her at bay with an outstretched arm. Then he stretched his neck around, some loud cracks escaping his vertebrae, as he turned his head every which way. "Look," Tuya suddenly said from his other side, before lifting the jacket that she had so far been carrying around loosely thrown over her shoulder and quickly pulling it over her arms. "Nice, huh?" She briefly twirled in place like she had done earlier, to show off the new item of clothing. "Very nice," Nia chimed in, and quickly put her hands onto Tuya's shoulders to pull her back from her flamboyant display, to which James mildly smiled with a single chuckle. Then his eyes wandered upwards. "Did you get everything you need, treasure?" he asked Sheila with a candid look. Sheila pointed over at the bag she had discarded next to the door. "I think so," she said. "At least I got everything that Nia told me to." James nodded at his sister thankfully, before sauntering over towards the bags, with Coco remaining hot on his trail. "Well, if she thinks so," he mused as he crossed the room. "Nia knows a thing or two about staying warm." With that, he leaned down to briefly inspect the bags. His eyebrows seemed to lift slightly as he opened the first one, and she'd assumed that may have been due to him spotting the number of hygiene articles she had brought, in addition to the clothes. However, he didn't let that stop him for long, and instead inspected the clothes underneath. "Trust me," Coco said, using the opportunity of him bending down to put her hands onto his back and leaning close to his face so she could coo right into his ear. "You can't wait to see her in those." James's eye roll was tangible, but he still smiled. After everything he had already seen of her, she'd have doubted that he would be all too angsty about seeing her in thick winter clothes of all things. Once again, James checked the time, and it almost seemed like he was still in the process of waking up, since his movements were still slightly sluggish. "Guess we better book our tickets soon," he said into the room, with his eyes on his screen. "Won't want to get stuck with an inopportune flight." There was a chuckle from the other end of the room. "And we'll have to go through customs this time," Tuya announced, humourful, and her left hand reached up to the metal rod that pierced through part of her nose, seemingly playing with it for a second, which she'd have thought just couldn't be pleasant at all. "So, make sure you're not bringing anything that'll get us held up." Everyone seemed to nod in agreement, although James was left to stare down at his arm. She'd remembered their first conversation after his operation. "I'm officially a flight risk now," he had said back then. "Maybe we should try to get there early, just in case," he now mumbled with a hesitant chuckle, and his tone seemed to cause Coco to put her own hand onto his mechanical one supportively.
"It's a shame that you have to go already,"
Moar now softly lamented, and scratched at the fur on her neck.
"I would have loved some more time to catch up."
James smiled up at her. "We'll come by again after we've settled down for a bit," he promised happily, putting his hand over his heart. "And if you have time for it, I'd love to show you around the compound with a vid call. Give you an impression of Earth and my home, even if you can't visit it yourself." Moar lit up slightly.
"That would be lovely, James," she said with a happy nod.
However, She'd listened up slightly at his choice of words. "Compound?" she asked, as she wasn't quite sure in what context he was using that specific word here. Instead of James replying right away, Nia spoke up to that. "The house is surrounded by pens and enclosures for the animals," she clarified, and it almost seemed like she was talking to Tuya as much as she was to Shida. "We call it the compound." The animals, right. The reason James had most of his scars. And they really lived surrounded by them? "It's just about the coolest place ever," Coco cheerfully chimed into the conversation, as if she needed to advertise their destination to anyone. "Or at least it was when I was a girl. I mean, it was like having a zoo around the corner, but there were also people going inside and working with the animals. It was awesome." Tuya smiled mockingly. "Also, there was a cute boy working there, huh?" she insinuated, and nodded in James's direction. However, despite her openly flirtatious demeanour, Coco made a bemused and almost slightly disgusted face. "Yeah, right," she said, in an all but ridiculing tone. "Jamie and Nia were like 5 back when I moved to their area, so sure, a cute boy, if you mean cute in the guinea pig way." Tuya appeared slightly taken aback by that reply, and she'd have wondered if the green-haired woman may have forgotten the age gap between the commander and almost everyone else in the room for a moment, which admittedly still wasn't extremely vast, but still enough to make a big difference during childhood years. However, most of the others got a good chuckle out of that comment, even James himself. Then he turned his head to look up towards Curi. "What about you, Curi?" he asked openly. "You can handle the gravity, right? Do you want to come along?" However, Curi remained silent for a moment before shaking their body. "I already have arrangements," they informed him, "but I will try to make time for the video call." James lifted his eyebrows. "They're working with Nairobi Dynamic Robotics on some of their new drones," Nia happily informed from the other side of the room once more, apparently quite in the loop about the cyborg's endeavours. "Nadairo?" James perked up surprisingly, before throwing an impressed look over at Curi. "Wow, that's quite the connection. Can't say you haven't earned it, though. Congrats, Curi." The cyborg nodded in appreciation. "Thank you, James," they replied earnestly. "Guess that means it's just us Deathworlders again," she'd amused from her position up on the armrest, from which she now pushed herself off again. Moar looked at her in slight surprise, most likely not expecting her to use her own designation like that. But the humans just nodded. "Seems like it," Tuya agreed, and briefly cracked her knuckles to relax her hands. Then she looked over to James, who was still working on his phone. "So, when's the flight?" James shifted his lips. "First one that isn't booked to hell and back is in 2 hours, he mumbled. Nia immediately piped up at that. "Perfect," she exclaimed, sounding quite honestly elated about that time window for some reason. "That means we can walk to the port and still have enough time to be there early." Shida looked at her in slight exasperation. "Walk?" she asked, with a disbelieving tilt of her head. Surely there had to be some form of transport available that would mean they didn't have to walk. Tuya also seemed to glance at her in slight confusion. However, Coco and James just briefly glanced at each other before nodding. "Sounds good to me," James announced, putting his phone away after presumably booking their tickets. "Yeah, let's go before everything's too full at the terminal," Coco agreed, and moved together with James to go pick up their luggage, that had seemingly been stored in Moar's bedroom for the time being. Nia joined them once they walked past her, leaving Shida and Tuya to look confused for a bit longer. They glanced at each other, both just able to shrug. Apparently, they would be walking.